Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's live stream. Ursula Dubosarsky, Do Teens Still Need Books, which the Wheeler Centre is presenting in partnership with the Australian Childrens Laureate Foundation. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that today's conversation takes place across unceded sovereign land. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Kulin Nation, and Ursula Dubosarsky is joining us from the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. We both pay respect to these communities' elders, past and present, and to the elders of all communities and cultures that this conversation reaches. Ursula Dubosarsky, who is joining me today, is the Australian Childrens Laureate for 2020 to 2021. She has written over 60 children's books, books for children and young adults, and won multiple awards, including nominations for the International Hans Christian Andersen and Astrid Lindgren Awards for Children's Literature. My name is Bec Kavanagh, and I'm the schools programmer here at the Wheeler Centre, as well as a writer and academic. This event is live streamed and will be recorded. For those of us who are joining us online, please feel free to drop any questions you have into the live chat and we'll try and get to them. And thanks for everybody who has submitted questions to us already. Ursula, welcome back.
Thank you.
Third welcome of the day.
That's right. It's a big day of communication, which is
big
great.
Day. Now, Ursula, we have spoken a couple of times today about your role as laureate, but I would like to ask you one more time just to briefly outline what that is. And I thought perhaps for the purpose of this session, you could give us a brief overview in terms of why you believe it's so important to get kids reading and, as your missive says, to keep them reading for life.
Yes, read for life. Well, yes, the Children's Laureate has been going for about 10 years in Australia now, and somebody is appointed every 2 years, and that somebody is a sort of, writer or illustrator who's been writing or illustrating for quite a long time. And so this is the first of my 2 years, and the purpose of the Laureate is to celebrate children's reading, and to emphasize the centrality, the need for the centrality of reading in the lives of children. And so that's what I'm here to do for the next 2 years. And each laureate picks a sort of project that they work on, and my particular project is connected with getting children to join their local public library, to become members of the local library and go down to the local library and borrow books on a regular basis, to learn to become a self-motivated, happy, fluent, broad-reaching reader. And the motto that you can see on the poster behind me, like my motto, slogan, whatever it is that I've chosen, is read for your life. So that, it's in childhood that by and large the becoming a reader for life is set up. Those foundations are laid down in childhood and early adulthood to become a really good, open, able, competent, highly literate reader. And in the sense of why do we want anybody to be a good reader, I mean, my feeling is that in a sense, nobody is arguing that we don't want our children to be good readers. I mean, everybody, I think, agrees that we want our children to grow up to be fully literate citizens of the world, that we don't want most of the children not to be able to read much and only a tiny percentage of sort of lucky, very keen readers to be the literate ones. We want a literate, generally literate society. There haven't been laws against reading for quite some time, I'm glad to say. So I tend to feel that we can take it for granted that we want children to read. And I think if there was a referendum tomorrow, do you want your children to be good readers? Like 99.999% of people will tick the box, yes. I suppose what is more difficult is, how to encourage them to become good readers. We can all agree we want children to be good readers, but then the challenge is, particularly, I suppose, in the well-known fast-paced digital world, how can we make them make sure that they do. I don't think we can make them, but we can do whatever we can to make sure that they become good readers.
So, Ursula, what does broad literacy look like to you? I know that you've spoken in interviews before about this need for not just being literate in terms of having the ability to read, but of being broadly literate. And I wonder if you could speak a bit about what that broadness looks
Well,
like.
that's right. I suppose it's sort of what one might generally call a good reader. What we think of as someone who is a good reader is somebody who's a confident reader, that if they go to the library and they look at a whole lot of books, they know that they can pick one out and open it up and they'll be able to read it. And that means you've had to have read through a lot of types of books to have that sort of confidence, not just one type of book. You have to have read not just, say, contemporary books, you also have to have read books that were written 100 years ago, 500 years ago. You have to have read different genres of books to understand the different dynamics, or the different, what would you call them? Not rituals, the sort of the way those sorts of books operate. To understand how different sorts of books operate is more than just being able to read the particular words. The sort of the whole book, the type of book. And then for me, the idea of a good reader is somebody who gets pleasure out of reading. It's something that makes them happy. It's something they want to do. It's something they need to do every day of their life, that they feel a little bit uncomfortable if they haven't been reading something. And I suppose it's a kind of exploratory stimulation of the mind through written language that is the inheritance of all human beings. It's a sort of vital and dynamic part of human civilization that you would feel we all have the right to have access to.
I'm wondering, because a lot of conversations that we have around teens and teen reading seem to come down to, or it seems to, one of the common themes, that comes up in conversations that we have around teens reading is how do we get reluctant readers on board? And seems to speak to this idea that when we become an adolescent, that goes hand in hand with being a reluctant reader, which is probably for a number of reasons. And even for myself, I remember as a teenager, I got to a point of I was a good reader. I could read well. I could read long books. I could read difficult books, but I just didn't have that joy. I didn't want to keep reading anymore. And I probably stopped reading for about 6 or 7 years. I'm wondering, have you experienced anything like that? Has there been a time in your reading life where you've stagnated or found yourself struggling to experience that joy? And if so, what caused it and what brought you back?
Well, I have to say personally, no. I feel it's a tragic period of your life. I feel really sad about it. Although there's something else that's not sad about it, in the sense that readers come back, don't they? Just because somebody kind of stops reading, it doesn't mean they won't suddenly or even gradually return. And I guess that's what the Read for Your Life is all about. It's so you didn't lose the ability to read when you were having your 7 years of fallow times, or whatever it was. You could still, it was still there, sort of inside you. It had been laid down inside you, and then it kind of woke up for some reason. I guess the vagaries of human experience are mysterious, aren't they? I mean, you perhaps know why you stopped reading, or do you not know? I mean, that's very interesting, isn't it? Because you're quite right in the sense that if we're just looking at reading ability, which is connected, of course, incredibly connected with how much people read. So it's sort of, in a sense, unsurprising when we know that teenagers do stop reading. It is also unsurprising that when in all these public tests of teenagers reading, that only about 10% of Australian teenagers are classified as good readers, Whereas when they're 8 years old, it's about 35% of them. So there is this, but teenagers do stop reading, and you won't be a good reader without reading. I mean, that's sort of, it's one of those interesting things when people say, oh, how do I make my child a good reader? Well, do they read much? No. Well, the only way to be a better reader is to read. There's literally no other way that will make you a better reader. And I know that sounds unbelievably obvious, but sometimes I think people somehow forget that there must be an app that will make my child a better reader, but there just isn't. The only thing that will make you a better reader is reading, and only reading will do it.
All right. So as a follow-up question then, I think, because you're right, I can absolutely pinpoint why I stopped reading. And for me, it was because my high school library had no books that I connected with. And so I eventually stopped seeing myself as a good reader. So perhaps you didn't have that experience. So instead, maybe we can look at, how was it that you so successfully navigated that? Because I think we lose readers during that time of transition. We lose them. We might have developed them as good readers as children, and then they start to transition from being child readers to readers who want something meatier, something more complex. And if they don't find that book that they're hungry for, they stop seeing themselves as a reader, and their path diverges down that non-reader track. So I wonder if you have any thoughts or are able to look back at your own experience and think about the things that made that transition time successful for you, or as a writer in your experience.
Well, look, it's certainly true that, for example, if your school is lucky enough, say, to have a library, the secondary school library is a different kind of place to a primary library. Primary libraries tend to be kind of, fairly, you have a sense of having fun and leisure and, dressing up and book week and whatever. Secondary school libraries do tend to have a more sort of serious atmosphere about them. And probably the collection is often fairly dominated by the needs of the curriculum, which is supporting the teachers. So you understand that. So it's quite possibly that you are not going to get the kind of broader collection of, say, fiction or even of nonfiction that you might in a primary school library, where there is more emphasis on reading for pleasure. And so for me, I have to say, for my entire high school years, I mean, there may have been a few Saturdays off, but I went every Saturday to my my local public library and borrowed 6 books. You're allowed 6 books, and I get the bus to the library, get my 6 books, and come home and spend all weekend reading them, and then do the same thing the following Saturday. And of course, in the public library then, I was not, and we were talking before about that transition stage between, when you're about 12, between being in the children's library and the adults library. And so what you have there, if you've still got the children's library there, but then there's also this amazing, rich world of these adult books that you can explore. It's almost like there's this whole new universe that I could go to. So I never had any sense of there not being something I could find in the library that I would want to read. I just don't remember that sense at all. I did also use my school library, but not with the same sort of largesse or something. Do you know what I mean? It didn't have the same sort of bounty. It just couldn't, I suppose. It'd probably be an unusual secondary school library that would be as sort of full and rich for a teenager as perhaps the local library would be. I mean, I guess that's right. A school library will often have a great range of what you might call teenage fiction, or fiction that's known to be very popular amongst teenagers or loved by teenagers, which is fantastic. But I guess when you go to the public library, there's also, you can kind of move between all those worlds in a way. Do you know what I mean? Between the teenage world, the child's world, and the adult world. There's just this sort of extraordinary range of books that, because I think at different times of your life, you sort of hardly know what you want to read. or what you don't want to read. And there's all sorts of reasons for that as well. When look, I'm old, but when I was young, teen fiction was not a sort of popular. It wasn't something people. It didn't have the kind of status perhaps that teen fiction has now. So it was sort of, which is sort of silly because they're all books, but you bring these attitudes to them. So I would have brought a kind of attitude to whatever books were set on a shelf that was supposed to be for teenagers, which was my loss. But that, I think you don't have a lot of control over all the attitudes that we all bring to the bookshelves. So I guess as comprehensive as possible, an experience of available books is the desirable thing, so you can kind of slowly work your way around it.
Do you think that we should be encouraging readers in a linear fashion, which we see quite often? I know I see this in the bookshop that, we'll have people coming in and going, that's not complicated enough for my reader. They're a good reader. And they certainly have this sense of good reading in terms of book length and thickness and age appropriateness, etc. We should be moving forward. I'm wondering if you think that we should be more sprawling and diving back into and re-enriching younger texts even as much as we move forward and discover new texts.
I totally do. And I think what is very unfortunate is any sense of embarrassment about what you read. You know what I mean? And I think that sort of, oh, that's a baby book, or that's too young for you, or something like that, when there can be just so much in that book for you. And I have to say, I don't remember feeling that as a child. I'm embarrassed now, but I used to pretend to read books that were. I remember when I was in year 7, I used to year 6. This book meant nothing to me. I used to carry around A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This book meant nothing to me, but for me, it was sort of like my signal to the world about how serious I was about reading. Whereas I was, much happier reading Agatha Christie or, Enid Blyton. So it's sort of. But may I say, my teachers and librarians and parents were quite tolerant of it, even though I'm quite sure they knew perfectly well Ursula was not reading this bloody book, right? But they didn't make me feel embarrassed about it. I didn't feel embarrassed about it. I wasn't shamed about it. And I think it's very unfortunate to associate shame and anxiety of any kind with reading. There are so many things out there to be ashamed and anxious about in the world. It just seems to me terrible that that sort of unhappiness should be associated with choices of reading. I mean, it's so interesting what you say about the bookshop, because I get that as well, that people will say, oh, a book that you feel that child actually wants, and they seem to be making their way towards it. The parent will say, oh no, that's got pictures in it, that's too young for you, you have to get this one. So it's I suppose what you hope, you hope this as a writer as well, that a person comes to a book on its own terms. And I'm sure teachers and librarians, teachers and librarians, of course, and I had a wonderful librarian in year 6 who was very good at encouraging me to read more widely, right? Whereas I just wanted to read Enid Blyton, apart from The Day in the Life of Alexander Ivan Denisovich. And I, like anybody, you cling to what you love, but this particular librarian, Mrs. Finberg, she was quite, she wouldn't take no for an answer. She would sort of encourage you to read beyond your comfort zone.
And how did she encourage you to do that? Did she take away the Enid Blyton?
I know. She just, I suppose, I don't really remember, but I don't remember it as traumatic. So what I would say is she didn't ask you what you thought of the book particularly. She didn't particularly expect feedback. And I think that was, for me, quite important, because particularly at that age, you actually don't know what to say. You haven't really formulated a kind of language apart from saying, oh yeah, I like, you don't know what, and that then makes you feel tense if you feel somehow you're going to have to perform about this book. So she didn't really do that. She did give me a little logbook. I'm sure she gave to everybody. I only remember myself being self-obsessed, obviously, at that age. And you were meant to write down your thoughts in your logbook, and sometimes I probably did, but it wasn't something that was checked, or I didn't feel I had to produce something as a result of reading these books. And I think actually that's probably really important in terms of that feeling of wanting to read, that if your wanting to read is sort of associated with some sort of task that you're going to have to kind of produce, I think that's, I think that takes away from that pleasure, deep pleasure principle that you would want to encourage in all children when they think about reading. That, and again, it's that also that sense that if that kind of reading that if that people often talk about, which is really true, that if you're not enjoying it, don't feel you have to keep reading it. Like to sort of try to keep pleasure paramount in this sort of reading. Obviously, when in school as part of the curriculum and so on, there are books that you have to keep reading to the end. And also, look, I must admit, I once got a letter from a child who said, yeah, I began your book the last week of December, and then I thought it was quite boring, so I stopped. And I thought, well, look, you didn't have to tell me. Anyway, I asked my daughter at the time, who was about 12 or 13, I don't know how to answer this letter. And she composed me a very nice paragraph that said something like, I'm sorry you didn't enjoy the book and that you stopped reading, because sometimes books are worth persevering with beyond the boring bits, and you might actually find that you enjoy it by the end. So I'm not sort of saying that you should encourage people just to read one word that's boring and toss it aside. But that kind of stamina, I think, is also something that you build up through lots of reading. Because reading, it's not necessarily like eating a Nutella sandwich. It can require effort. So sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. And I think wide reading sort of teaches you that some books require effort and some don't. But the ones that require effort are not necessarily not worth reading. And in fact, that sort of builds up your reading muscle as you read it. And then you can become a more adventurous reader. So, yes, sorry, that was...
No, don't apologize. I'm laughing because in our earlier conversation, you admitted to eating books, and now you're saying that reading is not like eating a Nutella sandwich, and I just think that perhaps sometimes it is like eating a Nutella sandwich.
It certainly is, and sometimes it should be, yeah.
I am very aware, as you're talking, that this speaks to quite strongly to one of the many challenges that English teachers would face, which is, and I would say increasingly with the, growing lack of teacher librarians in schools, and therefore the burden of that pleasure reading being placed on the teacher alongside the burden of that like depth of reading.
Yep.
Do you have any suggestions for teachers of how to navigate, on the one hand, all English teachers I know desperately want their students to love reading as much as they do. And then on the other hand, you do have to teach books in the way of the curriculum, and actually unpacking books in that way is sort of a different skill to reading for pleasure. So can those things exist in the same space, or do we have to read some books for like a greater understanding and then some to teach ourselves to read for pleasure? Oh, hang on. Sorry, just bear with us, folks. No, I can't. Ursula, can you hear us? You can. Um, is it worth her hopping out and coming back in?
Yep. Yes, I'm okay. So we'll just do it like this. You can hear me? Everyone can hear me?
Yep. Great. All
Mm.
right. Thank you. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you for bearing with us. Esther, just to recap, we had just been talking about that weird space that teacher librarians have to exist in of encouraging a depth of reading alongside a pleasure, the pleasure of reading.
Yes. Look, I guess I was an English teacher briefly myself, and I'm certainly aware how difficult it is to teach a book that apparently nobody wants to read. And in fact, you're aware that only 2 students in the class have really read. I mean, when I was, and teachers would certainly know a lot more than me about all the strategies you can use to encourage students to enjoy a book. And I certainly did a lot of reading aloud. And, at least that way, I think we were doing Brighton Rock, at least that way I knew that they had at the very least heard the words. I'd let them colour in or do whatever while I was reading, but otherwise it was sort of, I felt that we were conducting this sort of mutual fantasy. I was pretending they'd read it and they were pretending they'd read it, and nobody had really read it. So I suppose, you know, uh, teachers are often criticised, aren't they? Or the school system is criticised for killing people's love of reading. That seems to be, something that you hear from time and time again, that, why do we have to sort of dissect it? I mean, I don't think English teachers should lose heart, though, because it is actually uh, a wonderful and fascinating thing to discuss books and to find out how they work, and to think about different interpretations of books. So I don't think English teachers should feel they are killing literature for the young. I suppose it's I suppose what it's about. It's about, maybe it's very interesting what you were saying. It's about the young who have been used to thinking of literature as something you do for pleasure, and now it's being turned into something that makes them, they can fail, that makes them anxious. And I suppose, and I'm sure most English teachers do this. It's a matter of can can continuing to encourage that love of reading, of getting people to join the library. People I know have very successful class libraries of fiction, a bit like these sort of shared libraries you have on the street. I mean, look, I feel everybody listening to me would know all these sorts of techniques. I suppose that the main thing is to try not to lose heart when faced with, a bank of people glowering at you, when you're trying to. Look, it's interesting, also, you'd have to say, and this is not. For me, the things I remembered most pleasurably in English classes was poetry. And I think that was because we were talking about this a little bit before, Bec, about that notion of the shared experience of reading a poem out loud together in the class, and then just talking about responses to it. And those, for me, we did Philip Larkin and Ted Hughes. Those Stevie Smith, those sorts of things, that they for me were what I have carried with me for the rest of my life from my English classes. So maybe that is also, I'm just thinking aloud now, something to do with the reading aloud, that it's that, and the teacher, in reading out these sort of strange lines, we're all struggling together to work out what it means, rather than there's a secret that, you know, you've got to find out, and there's a right or wrong, that sort of sense. So I suppose what I'm saying is I think the teaching of poetry is fantastic. And if I was an English teacher, I would be choosing those options all the time to teach poetry to teenagers, because I think it was not just me responding, but I guess perhaps one of the reasons why I remember those classes so well is, you know, you had the sense of the whole group responding, of people staring at 3 or 4 words in a line and you know, having great arguments about it and so on. And certainly the teacher didn't, she just, her expression was patient and puzzled as she listened to what we said, but she didn't say, no, that's wrong, or this is this. She just sort of, so again, it's to do with that sense of freedom of thought, I suppose, isn't it? I guess teenagers can feel trapped inside novels in a classroom, that there's some sort of trap.
I think that is so interesting that you say that, because I think that, I mean, firstly, it's interesting to me because, you know, it seems like one of the major platforms that your laureateship is based on is this sense of agency and freedom to experiment and create. And I think when you, apply that to a space which is kind of quite constrained by things like curriculum and unpacking ideas and being able to write down answers, to be able to find a way where you can still have that freedom, I can definitely see the opportunity for teens to engage there. I also think it's so interesting though, because I think it just screams to why teachers and librarians and libraries need to be better supported, because you know, the skills that we learn through books and through reading are so vital to who we are and who we become. And yet we expect all of them to happen in these very small and increasingly smaller spaces, where maybe you have to learn pleasure reading in one space and you have to learn, you know, understand.
Well, and what a good point, because the fact is reading takes time. You know, it's something that takes time, and it may not be often that very much time is given to reading, or perhaps even the students don't understand how much time it takes to become a good reader. That, you know, it's and as we were saying before, it's about opportunity, isn't it? It's about access to the books, but also access to the time and the space to read in, I guess. And of course, you know, patience is everything in teaching, isn't it? I remember someone who taught me a foreign language many years ago. I asked him, because I thought he was a very good teacher, you know, what are the most important qualities of a teacher? And he said, patience and to love people. These were the supreme qualities. And I've always remembered it, because it does seem to me, of all the professions in the world, that teaching demands extraordinary amounts of patience and faith in the students.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got some really good questions here from the audience, so I wanted to make sure that we that I include some of them. One is about something that I think we could implement, which is, hang on, I've lost it now. What are ways that we can encourage teens to read and write together? And I think that really speaks to what we're just talking about, you know, that sense of creating reading communities.
So is that question meaning sort of in groups, in a sense?
Yeah, I think so. Do we need to encourage them to read out loud to each other?
I think the reading out loud is I'm a huge believer in it. I think it is quite wonderful. And I think the thing is, when you are reading out loud to people, you can't expect them to be paying attention the whole time. Their attention waxes and wanes, but it kind of comes in and out. We all know that from listening to audiobooks. Suddenly, you what's happened? You weren't listening. You haven't got that much control over it. But I think it's sort of like riding waves. It's quite a beautiful experience of reading, and I think listening to written language, which of course is different to spoken language, you learn an awful lot about reading by listening to written language. All those conventions and ways of the language is used when it's written down. You hear it out loud. And then when you do come to the written book, it's not as daunting because you've sort of absorbed quite a lot of the way that book is written. And I think, look, it's interesting. By temperament, I personally have never been very good at writing groups. And I don't think I would have been very good as a teenager either because of that it's a kind of, I don't know, I've just never been good at it. I just sort of don't want to show anyone my work. And I don't want to read it aloud, and I don't even necessarily want to hear anybody else's. Sorry, this makes me sound like a terrible person, but that's what I'm dealing with. So not all people who love to read and write necessarily want to be part of a group. I suppose that they might, and some people love it, but in some ways, the reader, it can be a communal activity, as we were just discussing, and particularly wonderful as a communal activity, I think, to bring people in. But readers are often, and writers are often quite, maverick, lone figures, aren't they? They sort of, and then, look, I must say the only time I have in all the years I've been going into schools have ever come across a librarian who appeared to be against reading was I'd given my talk, and there was a little boy who kept asking all these questions. Great questions. Obviously, this little boy was somebody, he had some great bank of stuff inside his head. He was obviously a big reader. And at the end, I said to the librarian, after they'd all run out into the program, oh, that little boy was, he was very engaged or something like that. And she said, oh, yes, he's always reading. In fact, he's not allowed to read at lunchtime anymore. We take the book away from him because, it's just no good. There was a boys' school, and clearly the priorities were on socializing and running around with the other boys in the playground. Anyway, that, may I say, is the only time I've ever come across anybody who's actually like against reading. But on the whole, that little boy, that is a fairly, we all know those sorts of little boys or girls that's they just want to be with that book. The life of the mind, for some reason, for them is more enchanting than the life they see around them in the playground, and they're just drawn to that other world all the time. So yes, so I guess for I can obviously only be encouraged for those that want to read and write together. I think what is wonderful about poetry reading actually is you're reading at a very you dissect the it's not going to encourage anybody. You might look at a single line, so there might only be 4 or 5 words in the line, and you can talk about that for half an hour. Like you can just sort of get on a roll and keep talking about it, and that it's a kind of really whereas I think it's more daunting to talk about a whole long novel or play or something like that, but at those sort of levels you can, and they're full of meaning, those 5 words and endless interpretation. So I think it also demonstrates the intensity, the power of language, the multiple meanings. That's what language is. It's not a sort of code. It's a kind of it's a sort of explosion of meaning.
Do you think that we have to fight against the external pressures or competitors of social media, technology, but also things like sports and extracurricular activities? How, as teachers, as librarians, as parents, do we encourage teens to keep reading or to prioritize reading during that time?
Well, I think that's right, that you have to prioritize it. That I think it's true, as we all know. You know, the phone is an endless source of interest and delight, and it's a naturally very disruptive thing. That's why it's interesting. Bing, bing, there's always something new to look at. And to read requires, you know, the effort. Even a book you really love requires a level of sustained concentration that can't bear too much interruption, you know, even if you love to read. And I suppose I think it is true that, you know, there's just this massive amount of entertainment in the broadest possible sense around us beyond books. But if we believe it's important, and I honestly think everybody does believe it's important, that this future generations are good readers, that reading doesn't become some sort of esoteric art, you know, that only a very few people can do, as it might have been in the Middle Ages. You know, that's not the sort of society we want. And so if we do want future generations to be good, confident, able, wide-ranging, intelligent readers, then you have to prioritize it. You have to remember that all the time. And I think, you know, with all those other activities, it's true. Like with a parent, I think, you know, if you say, oh, there's no time to go to the library on the weekend, well, then what you really are actually saying is, well, I'm not prioritizing reading, even if in theory I am. You know, that it's sort of, you know, as the kindergarten teacher might say, you can't do everything. You can't do everything. And so you have to decide what you think is important. And if you think reading is important, then I think you have to remind yourself of that every single day, and to bring it back to the center of life and education, rather than something that you hope you pick up on the way, because you don't pick it up on the way. It's a sophisticated activity. You know, it requires a lot of stuff and a lot of reading to be a good reader. Look, it's interesting. I remember a few years ago in Melbourne, I was at an event. We were talking about this, and a teacher said to me that she thought that her students very soon, perhaps even while we speak, would be unable to read something. I think she cited the example of Henry Lawson, but it doesn't actually matter whether it's Henry Lawson or not. It was simply an issue of something that had been written 100 years ago. She thought they would be unable to read it. And I suppose what's interesting about the example of Henry Lawson is that's not difficult to read. It's quite simple prose. It's not sort of weird, convoluted, difficult, high culture prose. It's sort of very, they should be able to read it. And yet she felt, because they were only reading very contemporary language, they'd lost the ability to read language even from 100 years ago. And I suppose my view is, you know, great works of literature over the centuries, you know, they're few and far between. You know, really great literature, it's not a common thing. And we can't just afford to dismiss a few thousand years of literature that so nobody will be able to read it. It'd be as if it's written in ancient Greek, you know. And that just seems to me, from the point of view of someone who loves literature and is a writer, I just think, you know, my own reading and writing was so enriched by, you know, works of the past as well as contemporary works that I can't imagine my mind without them.
So can you tell me a bit then about the choice to write things like The Word Spy and to delve more into nonfiction and the history of language, to be able to give readers the skills to approach those works of fiction? Because otherwise I'm aware that reading can become a real, like, class-based activity where, you know, only people who have had access to particular levels of education or types of books are able to engage with those works that you're talking about. So can you talk a bit about why you turned to nonfiction and what interests you about that?
Well, look, I began when I was working on a children's magazine called the New South Wales School Magazine, and I was asked to write a sort of column about, or maybe I suggested it, I can't remember, but about words. And the magazine it's a governmental magazine, and it's for all children in New South Wales primary schools. When I say all children, I mean all levels, all types of children, all levels of language. It's not sort of a magazine for eggheads, right? It's sort of meant to be accessible across the entire population of primary school children. And I very much felt exactly what you were saying, that when you start to play with words and start to talk about why a word is spelt this way or what this word game means, the sorts of things that all children love playing with, making silly sounds, playing around with words like a toy, that I absolutely wanted to bring into that that sort of history and heritage of literature from the past, as well as contemporary expressions of literature, so that exactly as you say, that it's not like a closed door, that in fact there's a way in. You know about that now. If you read, in the when we're in the section on euphemisms, for example, I put an excerpt of the bit where David Copperfield's headmaster is not very subtly telling him his mother's dead, right? So it's very readable for any sort of level of reading of primary school. About a little boy at school, his mother's dead. It was about euphemisms. And then my feeling was, well, they will then have seen that word Charles Dickens. They will have heard that word David Copperfield. It's not a totally closed door to them. That if David Copperfield is not on the shelf in the library, they'll never find out about it, that kind of thing. So in that, certainly in those books, I absolutely wanted to open the world of all kinds of literature to children. So thank you for mentioning that, because that was a big thing for me in what I wanted to do with those books. Was I wanted to, as you say, open those, not have this sort of, it's not all high literature examples, but particularly the examples of high literature, I certainly didn't want them only associated, they're only accessible to people who have had a certain sort of education that is, rare and expensive.
And just on that topic of open doors, it's heartening to see so many ways in now, isn't it? Where we've got graphic novel adaptations of the classics, or with verse novels as a way into young adult literature that perhaps isn't as daunting. It seems like there are more and more ways of opening. So I guess
I think both of those. I love verse novels and I love graphic novels. I think they're wonderful. Yeah.
And do you see them as, well, what role do you think that they play for teens and for young readers?
Well, if they're good, they're just great books to read. I suppose the graphic novel in particular is not a totally new form, but it's sort of it's pushing its way to the forefront, and there's such wonderful, imaginative, and very both literary quality and sort of just wonderful graphic work as well in them. I just think that they can be fantastic. I mean, like everything, it's not really the form; it's the it's whether it's well done. I suppose that's what it's all about to me. It's not, and look, I suppose what you're saying is that a person can be quite daunted, and I don't blame them by, I'm not going to read that, and I feel that myself sometimes. And look, when I think about it, it's certainly true. I think a lot of novelists are, what a novel is, I suppose, is kind of changing, and it's much more common now to include graphic features in books. And certainly in my book, The Blue Cat, I have quite a lot of illustration of sort of photographs and various artifacts that are included in that book as a way of adding meaning, but also I think you're quite right, as a way of making the task of reading less daunting and less dense. that so, and that certainly graphic novels are less forbidding in that sense. Although often, it's interesting, isn't it, that the sort of the aesthetic style of graphic novels in itself can be that's most common can be quite forbidding in a way. So it'll be interesting to see that kind of branch out a bit. But and verse novels like that are pages with lots of white space. When we were talking about the word spy, we were very aware of that because, as I said, with the word spy, these books were for all children, right? Not for children that read 50 books a week. And so we were very aware that we wanted, they're beautifully illustrated by Toby Riddle, and we had a lot of illustration in them and also a lot of white space, so that it was that kind of sense that anybody can, you don't have to be frightened of a great wall of words in front of you. And I think those sorts of things are very important. Design is, a very high level art.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because verse novels and graphic novels are in no way, less complex than other novels inherently. So in a lot of ways, and in a lot of ways they kind of push back against a reader's own stereotypes around what they think a good reader looks like. And if they are not able to see themselves as a good reader, then these kind of books and open doors, I guess, give them the chance to reimagine themselves into that new role.
Yes, I find it so interesting the way you talk about imagining yourself as a good reader. That's a sort of very interesting way to look at it, that it's sort of about a kind of identity in a way. I'm a good reader, I'm not a good reader. And how that, if you decide you're not a good, or it's decided for you, or whatever, for whatever reason you come to the conclusion that you're not a good reader, how that kind of how sort of extremely important it is to come to terms with that. That's very interesting.
Ursula, well, we're out of time. Unfortunately, just let me see. I think I've covered everybody's questions. If I haven't, I apologize, but I think I've gotten everything in there as well as my own. Thank you so much for talking with me. That was just incredible, and I hope really valuable to the people who have been able to attend today. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being here, Ursula.
Well, thank you for the whole day, and particularly for just now. And thank you everybody for listening in and for your questions. And I it's hard not to be able to discuss these things in person, but this is the next best thing, and it's been a great experience for me. So I've had a lot of thoughts pinging away in my head through our conversation. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.